Hello and welcome to APUSH. Today, we're going to be discussing the aftermath of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. As we hopefully remember from last time, a complete accident or tragedy led to Teddy Roosevelt's ascension into the White House, and all of a sudden, forces that had been building in American history for decades took the forefront, and we finally got drastic progressive change. Of course, it's important to note that Teddy Roosevelt was not the only one who was pushing for these things. Many of these progressive movements trace their origins back to the Second Great Awakening and stuff we talked about last semester. But with the rise of Teddy Roosevelt and him taking the top office and being able to use his bully pulpit, now all of a sudden these issues started to be front and center, and we started to see the government acting on behalf of many of these causes. So let's talk about how the progressive era moved on after Teddy Roosevelt decided to go to retire and go to Africa for a while. So we're going to be looking at other areas of progressive reform here today. We're going to be looking at the effective of progressive constitutional changes, and then identify some of the areas where progressives maybe were not as successful. So let's dive in. As we hopefully remember, Teddy Roosevelt did not run for re-election, and we've got him nominating his hand-picked successor Taft. Here we see him, of course, elevating the crown prince on his shoulders. The Democrats again ran William Jennings Bryan for like the 15th time, but William Jennings Bryan had the difficulty of trying to run against the hand-picked successor of an incredibly popular president. And so, despite the fact that Bryan is a well-known orator, a very successful public speaker, all that stuff, Teddy Roosevelt's legacy and his endorsement of Taft really gave Taft a pretty substantial advantage. And so the result is here, of course. I'll give you a second to sort of take this in. But it looks pretty much like 1804, with, of course, the southern states still voting against Abraham Lincoln, but the North voting Republican, and now Taft becomes president. And honestly, Bill Taft was fine. He's our largest president, as hopefully you know because of the apocryphal bathtub story. And in general, he's going to carry on most of Teddy's policies. Taft was slightly more conservative than Roosevelt, but he was still a progressive, and so we are going to see many of the same things from Taft that we previously saw from Teddy. So what does that mean? Well, we're still going to see arbitration happening. We're going to see U.S. Steel. There was a strike, and the government seized it and stopped the strike, much like Teddy would have done had he been in office. And we're still going to see some use of the idea of the big stick. Although, of course, as we see here, Taft's conservatism means that he's not going to be quite as dramatic in his use of it. Taft is going to push for some tariff revisions because, of course, there's this massive push for a federal income tax, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so, of course, if the federal government is going to start funding itself through an income tax, they don't need to fund through tariffs anymore. And so Taft pushes to lower the tariff and to get in an income tax. Although, again, that's not going to happen until Woodrow Wilson's presidency, which we'll talk about in a moment. One of the greatest things that Taft gives us is Billy Possum. Hopefully you remember Theodore's mascot, the teddy bear, right? Because of the story of him not shooting this bear. Well, toy manufacturers were somewhat concerned that with Theodore leaving office, teddy bear sales would tank. And so they needed their own adorable toy to replace the teddy bear in the hearts and minds of the American people. And so as a result, we get Billy Possum. There was this awesome, equally amazing story of Taft once sitting down and eating an entire roast possum and then not getting indigestion. And so Billy Possum was born. Here we see an adorable Billy Possum, which is clearly going to displace the teddy bear in everyone's hearts and minds. And here we see a whole bunch of awesome Billy Possum propaganda. So yeah, I'm sure, of course, you remember growing up with your Billy Possum, which every American child has. And in all honesty, for some reason, the Billy Possum didn't catch on in the same way that the teddy bear did, and the whole project flopped. But of course, it's an amazing era in American history where, for a time, some children had a stuffed opossum that they would then care for and love and sleep with and all that fun stuff. The main thing, or one of the most dramatic moments of Taft's presidency, was known as the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. So Taft was not as much of an environmentalist as Teddy. This was one of the main splits. Teddy loved the outdoors and wanted to preserve the environment, whereas Taft was much more keen to develop these resources and to promote business as opposed to protecting the environment. And so he had this massive fight with Teddy's chief forester, his secretary of, the head of the Forest Service, Gerard Pinchot, and Taft fired him, which outraged Theodore and is going to lead to a break within the Republican Party. This leads Teddy to sort of become disenchanted with Taft, both because, of course, he doesn't feel like he's carrying on his legacy, he disagrees with the tariff policy, and there's this basic sense from Theodore and his supporters that Taft is kind of bungling the presidency. And so as Teddy Roosevelt emerges from his safari in Africa, he decides that maybe he's going to throw himself back into the presidential ring. This leads to the election of 1812, where there's this massive fight between Taft and Roosevelt for the Republican nomination. The Republican establishment, as you hopefully remember, was never totally thrilled with Theodore, and so they're going to stick with Taft, which leads Theodore to create his own third party that he calls the Bull Moose Party. This comes from both because of his general affinity for the environment and conservation, but also because of an amazing moment where Theodore was giving a speech. An assassin came up and shot him in the chest, and Theodore famously said, "It'll take more than that to stop a bull moose," and then went and gave the speech anyway. Apparently, the speech that he had in his pocket was thick enough that it helped deflect the bullet, and then afterwards he went to the hospital and got treated. And so it's kind of an Andrew Jackson cult of personality moment where Theodore takes a bullet to a chest and then gives a speech anyway. So now we've got three candidates. The Democrats nominate the president of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson, who's a progressive. The Republicans nominate Bill Taft, who's a progressive. And Theodore creates his own party, the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party, and he's a progressive too. So this is somewhat problematic, of course, because you have three candidates running on almost exactly the same platform. And it's very difficult to find daylight between Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism and Woodrow Wilson's new freedom, both which stand for government regulation of the economy and pushing progressive issues. And so what happens when three candidates are basically trying to get all of the same voters, and two of them are for the same party? Hopefully it's pretty easy to predict that something like this would happen. So hopefully you can suss out this map and understand that the vote between Theodore and Taft was split, which gives Woodrow Wilson a plurality of the popular vote and a massive majority in the electoral vote. And so for the first time since Grover Cleveland, and only the second time since the Civil War, we have a Democrat in the White House. And honestly, Wilson, as far as his progressivism, is fine. He's fine. He's going to pass what's called the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is an addendum to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which provides very specific very specific requirements as far as what is an illegal trust and what isn't an illegal trust. You might remember that the Sherman Act was relatively broad, which led to Theodore Roosevelt clubbing some trusts or crushing some trusts and not crushing other trusts. Well, Wilson makes it much more systematic. I mean, he's a professor. He likes having things clearly written out and sets up these standards to prevent basically presidents from arbitrarily taking on some trusts and not taking on others. So we get that. We get the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, which investigates unfair business practices, so more government bureaucracy to sort of regulate these monopolistic principles and making the whole process more systematic. And we get the breakup of many of these monopolies because, of course, Theodore would use restraint towards companies that he thought were providing an important public service, whereas the Clayton Antitrust Act means that if you're Standard Oil, you're going to get broken up. And so Standard Oil gets broken up, U.S. Steel gets broken up, all those monopolies that were created in the Gilded Age get broken up into other companies during Wilson's term. And so he represents kind of the footnote or the ultimate conclusion of Theodore Roosevelt's trust busting, because all these trusts actually get busted now. It's not just trusts that piss Teddy off, it's all trusts that violate the Clayton Antitrust Act. Under Wilson, we also get the two of our four progressive amendments. One, the income tax actually passes, and so we're able to now lower tariff rates to some extent in order to lower prices for American people. And American businesses are now, because of the massive growth through the Gilded Age, are able to compete more effectively in the world market. And so now American consumers can buy goods more cheaply because of lower tariffs, but they have to pay more of their income in the income tax. So fortunately, of course, the downside or the plus side of the income tax is it's a much more reliable system of revenue than having to rely on global trade. Because, say the world decides that they're going to fight a massive war, now we don't have to rely on selling and buying things and tariff money from Europe in order to finance the government, which is going to be important in, about 2 years here. The other one is the direct election of U.S. senators. The Senate was a very exclusive and incredibly corrupt club by this point. And so the 17th Amendment, the 16th Amendment is the income tax, of course. The 17th Amendment provides direct election of senators, cutting out the corrupt state legislatures and making the government more responsive to the people. Wilson also creates our national bank, the Federal Reserve Board. This is going to standardize currency and be the ultimate conclusion to this whole argument about the national bank that goes all the way back to Hamilton and Jefferson. So we create the Federal Reserve Board, standardizing currency, giving the government sort of a potential lender of last resort to prevent bank failures if they choose to. And it allows the government to use tools called monetary policy in order to expand or contract the economy and keep things going relatively steadily, and managing a combination of inflation and unemployment in order to make sure that the economy is growing steadily and sustainably. So the Federal Reserve Board is now our national bank, and it is still currently our national bank. Progressives also pushed on the local level. It's important to note that this is not just a national movement. There's a lot of local advocates also pushing for things. For example, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which apparently you all learned about in middle school, they start passing like safety requirements for buildings and for factories. You have to have like fire escapes that aren't made out of wood, and emergency exits that are not locked and things like that, in order to prevent tons of people from dying in a fire. We also start cracking down on child labor, starting to pass mandatory schooling laws, which, is good, I guess. Get kids out of those factories and into schools. So that's probably a positive. We pass housing requirements, requiring these tenements to have, again, emergency exits, basic levels of sanitation, things like that. And we start reforming, governmental systems to theoretically make them less corrupt. So moving away from powerful mayors who theoretically can be bribed to city councils who then hire managers who are theoretically less corrupt than the mayors. So all of these systems try to eliminate corruption, to cut down the sort of worst abuses of industrial society, and to make people's lives better through pretty much government laws and interactions based on studies and evidence. The biggest example of this is what's known as the Wisconsin Program, or the Wisconsin Idea. This is pushed by Wisconsin Governor Battling Bob La Follette. And it basically is the blueprint for what all other states are going to create. So creating a state income tax, industrial commissions to investigate business practices and regulate big business. They start passing the recall and initiative in order for citizens to directly put stuff on the ballot, or referendums where citizens can directly vote on laws, with the idea being that academic experts from the universities are helping to craft this legislation, and we're going to be applying all of this in a much more systematic way. So the Wisconsin program is a model for progressive states, and many other states that are on the sort of left end of the spectrum start adopting it. And then there's civil rights. The progressives pushed aggressively for both more rights for women and more rights for African Americans. This is, of course, a continuation of the suffrage movement, going back to both, honestly, going all the way back to the Second Great Awakening. But obviously, after the 15th Amendment passed, many of these suffragettes got much more militant. We see Susan B. Anthony voting illegally and getting arrested in order to try to create a test case that utterly went nowhere. But at the state level, the state and local level, much of this is more successful. And so, although on the national level, there's enough resistance to prevent women from getting the right to vote, in the Western states and in more progressive states, we started to see women getting the right to vote much earlier. Wyoming, of course, leading the way, giving women the right to vote all the way back in 1869, because otherwise they wouldn't have enough voters to become a state. But other states quickly followed, and so although, again, nationally women do not have the right to vote, they do have the right to vote in a number of places. Obviously, the push to get women the right to vote starts to become much more organized during the Progressive Era. We get suffragettes picketing outside the White House, but then, of course, you get anti-suffragettes advocating that, what happens when women have to get the right to vote? Well, clearly they're going to ignore their womanly responsibilities. And look, who's going to, if women have to vote, who's going to sweep the house and take care of that house plant? And so, misogynistic arguments also promulgate this era. So this brings us back to the era of progressive reform. The other thing we haven't, obviously we talked about with Theodore Roosevelt, civil rights legislation. Obviously, providing more rights for African Americans is a no-go at the national level because the entire Southern delegation is going to continuously filibuster it. So here's your objectives. Hopefully you can answer these in some substantive detail. And then tomorrow we'll come back to take a short foray into the First World War.